Please hang up and try again.
This will be a truly massive presentation. What I did was I took the parts of the Gospel of Marcion as delineated by the Nag Hammadi website. This website breaks the Gospel of Marcion into 82 parts and references them with Luke chapters and verses. What this meant was that I had a linear Gospel of Marcion and I could easily tell which verses simply were not in the Gospel of Luke. This text also says where they got some of their fragments, and it also gives listings in the Panarion, which is a 4th century description of the text, mostly written in a derogatory manner, trying to prove Marcion altered Luke. Since most of Marcion is reflected in Luke, this makes things somewhat simple. Now, after listing my 82 parts, I cross-referenced Marcion with Mark and finally with Matthew. The end result looked like this. I noted the chapters and verses for all accounts, plugged in the missing Luke exclusive parts, and I noted the differences. For the most part, I was looking for big inconsistencies. I did note inconsistencies between Marcion and Luke. However, since most of those two texts are highly consistent, I didn't have to use a separate Luke column. I was able to condense that into one Luke Marcion column. The first thing that jumped out at me during this process was the timeline. Mark, Marcion, and Luke all have basically the same timeline. There were a few divergences, however, these three Gospels had an overwhelmingly consistent timeline. Matthew, on the other hand, looked like scrambled eggs. Matthew's timeline was flat out mixed, with very few consistencies with the other three. This was a surprising result. I had not expected any of the Gospels to display a big difference in time, and if Matthew is put in the correct timeline, the Matthew timeline would turn Luke, Marcion, and Mark to scrambled eggs. This is a rather important detail. However, there was another surprise in this timeline. As scrambled as Matthew was, the final 7 chapters mostly got in line with the rest. This was exceptionally surprising, and again, even if Matthew is put in order, all the other books line up on the last few chapters. Now, on consistency, there is a surprising amount of consistency between the 4 Gospels. The consistency flat out excludes the possibility of oral tradition. Certainly, oral tradition is important, but oral tradition cannot explain the similarities. They are too consistent. And if Matthew was prior to all the other Gospels, because of the consistencies, then all authors had to have this account and totally ignored his timeline, and 2 of them ignored his infancy account. They would all have to have Matthew's book because there are some exclusive similarities. This makes no sense at all. The only plausible answer for the timeline discrepancy is that Matthew cannot have priority. But if Matthew has no priority, then that leaves it up to Mark, Luke, or Marcion. Because of the inconsistencies of the timeline, Matthew may be a dead end, but it must follow something. This is where the spreadsheet comes into play. There was another important find here that I really didn't notice at first. If we place the 3 timelines together, you'll see what I'm talking about. Notice that Luke is way bigger than Marcion, and Mark begins just ahead of Marcion. This may seem unimportant at first, but let's dive further. Marcion begins basically at Luke 4:16. There is one verse before this that has been placed differently in Luke, but it's basically introductory and unimportant. What is important here is Marcion's account is strangely docetic. The end of this section is slightly different in Luke, but it's all basically there, and all very consistent. Mark's section has part of this account, but not the docetic stuff. What is really interesting here, however, is what comes before the Marcion beginning. Luke's account is massive before Marcion, adding all kinds of infancy accounts. Mark's beginning is very odd. His verses 1 through 15 are basically a story of John the Baptist. There is no infancy account, just an introduction that says John the Baptist came first. At first I didn't think this was important. However, going through Mark and Marcion, it became clear that Mark was putting far more emphasis on John the Baptist. This included a detailed account of the beheading of John the Baptist. The only other text that has that account is Matthew. And something else was here that was strangely missing with Marcion. See, in Marcion and Luke's Gospel, there's a problem with the trial of Jesus at the end, where Pilate ends up sending Jesus to Herod, who in turn sends Jesus back to Pilate, and Pilate and Herod end up being friends. But this is very, very bad for the Mark author. With John's stock rising, Herod obviously becomes a bit dumber and quite a bit more evil. So Mark skips the Herod ending and goes with a different ending entirely. Mark's ending is closer to a shorter version of Matthew because of the added emphasis to John the Baptist. Obviously, Matthew and Mark are from a different tradition than Marcion and Luke. It's a tradition that pumps up John the Baptist and dumps Herod. Marcion and Luke are mostly consistent, except that Luke includes the infancy accounts and some other smaller John the Baptist accounts in his first few chapters, but minus those chapters, Luke and Marcion are extremely consistent. So on priority, there are only two ways this works. Either Marcion was a moron that had no other text but Luke. He cut the text down, mostly cutting out John the Baptist and Jesus' infancy accounts for fun, while leaving references to Jesus' mother and siblings, and while keeping the importance of John the Baptist, but managed to keep the timeline together and somehow managed to keep it entirely consistent with Luke, adding a few slightly off accounts just for a weird effect. Or Marcion has priority, and the Catholic tradition of Marcion's heresy is flat out wrong. Marcion would be picked up by Mark. Mark is a somewhat polemic account, adding emphasis to John the Baptist and demonizing Herod. Matthew is a scrambled account from both Mark and Marcion, but also adding some infancy accounts. And Luke is last, adding even more infancy accounts, but mostly coming from Marcion. I really love elegant, simple solutions, and this one is fairly simple. A few other ideas that have come out of this process is that the Synoptics only have two resurrection accounts. The Mark and Matthew accounts are simply not consistent with the Marcion and Luke accounts. There is only one single source for these divergent accounts. It's the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Peter very likely has priority over all of these Gospels. We don't have enough of Peter to be sure, but his resurrection account certainly appears to be prior to everything. And finally, the infancy accounts come in part from the Gospel of James, but the Luke author appears to have expanded on the Matthew prequel as well. James is the priority source for infancy accounts. Mark's added emphasis to John the Baptist moved to Matthew. However, Luke preferred the Marcion account. Luke's additions to Marcion are only in the first few chapters, and a lot of them are about John the Baptist. The rest of Luke is consistent with Marcion. But Luke obviously has Matthew and may not have Mark at all. With slight adjustments, the Luke author overwhelmingly copied Marcion, but added an introduction and cleaned up some minor issues.